this lies this, which is made up of several components. The main subject of this video is the fusion of these elements to make this. Yep, there's more than one way to make a template. This is a method I chose to create one template to make a 3-part timber porthole surround. To begin, I've carefully cut 3 veneered MDF panels and placed them together in tight formation. I'm aiming to extract at least one usable template from this method, which I can then use to generate 18 timber duplicates. Off-screen, I recalibrated the CCG, then proceeded to remove the majority of the centre mass, leaving an appropriately dimensioned void. After separating the 3 parts, I selected the best of the bunch and used it to duplicate 3 copies that were then placed back together to confirm their precision. It was at this precise moment I knew the design was not complementary enough to the project to earn its place on the table's base. So I took another look at what inspired this element of the project, made some adjustments, confronted my doubts, then trusting in the modifications I'd just made, I selected a suitable Merbau plank, and as the doubts began to rise again, I carefully placed it on my workbench. Because of this committed action, the doubts faded and I laid out the modified templates to begin their conversion into timber. Now that I've cut and released these stenciled shapes, I can take these escapees and prepare them for a confrontation with their destiny. It's a confrontation that demands machine manipulation and controlled formation. Now, before I go too far, while these components still have flat surfaces, I'll use them to provide the floating tenon machine with an adequate area of registration to perform its primary task. I say controlled formation because the only way I could see to correctly form these components is to control the order of the process. If I used the bearing guided rebate bit before the roundover bit, then I would have cut off the edge the roundover bit requires for its bearing to be guided. If I did happen to get the order wrong, I'm sure I could figure out a workaround and fix the mistake, which is something I don't mind doing, but I'd prefer not to. So it's a good thing that I performed a couple of test runs first with some oak to get the order of operations correct. Now, with a nice edge-forming bit placed in the router's grasp, I applied some defining shape using a series of climb cuts. Although these close-up shots are nice, they're not nice enough to potentially receive bodily harm, so I changed the angle to accommodate the router fence for a safer, controlled approach. Although this small roundover looks insignificant, I believe it'll play a key role. Ultimately, once all these parts have formed the appearance of a cohesive whole, in order for these components to maintain their individual appearance, I'm applying a small roundover to each end. Before committing this pile of individual components to their ring-formed destination, there was one small task that required my attention before these parts were permanently connected. And I'll just leave it at that. Okay, I have 6 rings to assemble, but only 1 strap clamp, so I'm limited to gluing 1 at a time. Typically, when presented with the opportunity to clamp multiple objects of the same dimensions, I'd devise some sort of clamping system that would use 1 strap to clamp them all. Under optimal conditions, I'd address this type of repetitious task with multiple strap clamps. I don't own multiple strap clamps. So due to my limited circumstances, every individual ring will receive my undivided attention, which will be divided between other operations. I'm sure that my devotion to individual components will generate the best outcome. Also, considering I may not do anything like this again, I may as well exploit the experience for all it's worth. Even if the value derived from this repetition has me avoiding circular project attributes to be combined with curved surfaces in the future, then it's worth it. Or because of this experience, perhaps I'd devise an alternative method. Ultimately, time will be the deciding factor. So in light of my short list of options, as that sequence just portrayed, I settled on the one clamp method. After that explanation of my reluctance to construct a one-task devoted jig, for the following operation I was more than happy to take the necessary detour. When I chose to make these portholes, I knew that that decision came with a set of challenges. Because of this realisation and due to my somewhat limited options, when taking the challenges of this task into consideration, as I designed these features, that design simultaneously signified my commitment to the operation. Okay, this concave edge interlocks with this convex edge, like so. And away we go. It's moments like this, those moments that present themselves after you've made a new jig. It's a moment when an unintended purpose reveals itself in the form of a new application other than what it was designed for. Ultimately, this jig would yield multiple purposes. Its expansion of use proves that it was worth the extra effort to produce a custom jig. Unaware at the time, but when I made this jig, it harboured hidden agendas. Using the original template to generate the curves, this rudimentary structure was designed to simulate 1/4 of the base's curved sides that corresponds with the position of the porthole. It was a beautiful day to spray contact adhesive, so the replica received an adequate amount to achieve an excellent bond with 80 grit sandpaper. Now that the replica has been securely and comfortably positioned, the simulation's momentary existence was completely substantiated as the porthole jig was converted into a sanding sled. In doing so, one of its concealed agendas revealed itself, and there's more to come. Although the quality of the cut that the bandsaw left was good, in my opinion, it still required a little finesse to really embrace its destined position on the table's base. With the portholes surrounding fitted and its existence justified, I could return to the jig again, only this time I'll pass it through the bandsaw in a different configuration, one that'll give me a straight cut to reduce the bulk of the piece to obtain a uniform presence on the table's base.
Focus here.
Now the jig can be used as a work-holding rotisserie so I can drive drill bits through it, creating strategically positioned fixing holes for fixings. With the portholes surround having been fitted, now I can prepare the surface of the porthole to accommodate accurate placement for the tip of the brad point drill bit. After creating a small void, I'll fill it with an appropriately sized piece of dowel to match the diameter of the hole left by the drill bit. This piece of 8mm dowel is the keystone that completes this porthole insertion. I've numbered them 1 to 6 because every porthole receives its own piece of dowel. Even though this appears to be yet another component in an already crowded porthole, this dowel is a crucial and practical multi-component locator. It's a vital linchpin that keeps everything in its place as highlighted in this sequence. See? There it is right there in action. With all the portholes components fitted, I can begin the process in preparation for applying finish. But don't get too distressed by this abrasive sequence because I believe that sanding is an act best committed alone. If that scene looked familiar, that's because you've momentarily arrived for a second time in the middle of the void within the central transition point. From here, you'll now move into the next leg of this journey. By the time the end of part 3 rolled around, I'd cladded the sides of the base and opened up 6 voids in the sides, so this footage demands an explanation. In order for me to understand, then convey to others what I've been building, I'm not actually releasing these build videos in their chronological build order. Instead, I've chosen to release them in an order that I believe best portrays the project's construction from the ground level up to the table's top. Here I've put together a rudimentary representation of what I'll eventually convert into timber components that will form the tabletop substrate. It's a bit of a process going back and forth, taking measurements and gathering as much information as possible. I aim to generate quality templates that'll produce optimal components. When completed, the components will then be used to permanently join all the separated rails, ultimately making up the entire substrate for the table's top to rest on and be fixed in position. Because I've chosen to use off-the-shelf pre-dimensioned Merbu planks, in order to overcome the potential flaw in the design, the finished substrate will be quite substantial. Plus, I thought it'd be interesting to build it this way. With the substrate's proxy fitted and completed, it's time to remove it and begin the process of breaking down the timber that'll take its place. Once again, and in keeping with one of my objectives for this project, it's a matter of harvesting the most out of the material I have.
Focus.
I'm adding some bulk to the side rails. From there I'll use one of the templates I made earlier to apply a triple joint intersection. I've done this style of joinery before in the past, but on a smaller scale. What I'm planning to do here is the same, but double the scale. Having gone through the gauntlet of being cut into bits then reconfigured in an unnatural composition, the ordeal for this timber is only halfway through the process. I don't deliberately set out to make timber components that look like they were CNC machined. They just look that way at first. It's not until you take a closer look and the small inaccuracies reveal themselves. It's from those inaccuracies I take comfort in the fact I am very human, and I move on with the project. Now with the majority of the waste material removed, I can secure the templates. The templates will then carefully guide the bearing attached to the flush trim router bit, removing even more waste, and finally, if I've done what I intended with these templates correctly, start the shaping process. Due to the issues of working around grain direction, in order to adequately shape these components whilst working within my limited budget and my modest router bit collection, this presented me with the opportunity for experimental discovery, where I selected the most compatible router bits to achieve successfully shaped components. Although this bit performed well, it proved to be a little too brutal. So I swapped it out for a less intimidating bit, which was swiftly replaced by a substantial upgrade. As expected, this bit had its limitations, so I wasn't disappointed when it reached its limits, because I knew I could rely on my preferred bit to reach across the divide to complete the job. Looking back at these components now, I'd say my experimentation was a success, and as a consequence, I'm very pleased. Now, after the templates have been used for their intended function, I can now use them for a secondary function and attach them to serve as placeholders for the actual timber components, where I can use them as registration points so I can take measurements and cut the timber rails. It's a lot of preparation, but it's necessary and it gets me one step closer to completing the frame. With the correct measurements now permanently recorded in the length that the rails were cut to, I'd now like to take a moment to invoke some tradition. This situation commands two simple, traditional but effective cross-harping joints to be applied where the rails intersect over the top of the table's base. Making do with the tools I have, I've opted to combine a more traditional form of joinery with a modern twist or update. As you can see, first I pulled out the traditionally styled yet neglected panel saw to remove the bulk of the material, followed by some assistance from another traditionally styled hand tool. I say traditional style hand tools because these two examples have plastic handles. Then, after attaching the appropriate guidance system, I can invade the trench with a modern chisel substitute in the form of an electric router. Equipped with a bearing-guided flush trim bit, if successful, the router's trench invasion should leave some reasonably clean joinery in its wake. It's not an ideal method, but I believe this hybrid form of joinery has its place. With the rails cut to size, it's time to get into a more modern form of hybrid joinery. For this project, I've elected to use floating tenons. Because I use a certain power tool from time to time, which is actually on loan, thanks Matthew, that doesn't necessarily mean I subscribe to using the preferred tenons for that tool, especially on my budget, so I'll make my own. With the floating tenons made and cut to size, now I can perform a precautionary measure and dry fit all the components together. Gluing this frame together has taken a lot of preparation, so it's a rather big moment for me. I've checked that everything fits correctly and prepared all the clamping apparatus. But first I have some more curves and shaping to add and subtract from the substrate's rails. If I don't do this now, it'll be far more difficult to access all the components once they're fixed together. To achieve said curves, I cut a curve out of one of the rails, refined it, then used that rail as a router guide to duplicate the features. With the success of the freshly applied curves on the rails in hand, it was now a matter of using a large roundover bit to begin adding some shape, as all the components were easy to access at this stage. Even though the obstructions were minimal, it was essential not to disturb the joinery. That disturbance comes later when those intersections are blended and cleaned up once the substrate is made whole. With the two-part epoxy resin combined and mixed, I'm ready to glue these 67 separate components together permanently. At this point of the build, it was all going according to plan until, well, let me just say that this is the reason the word nightmare was used in the title of this video. I can assure you it's an honest use of the word as it describes the moment perfectly. Unfortunately, I can't show you that imperfect moment because as soon as I realised my mistake, the world turned black. Everything ceased to exist, except the impetus to adapt and overcome and dominate the moment. Well, sort of.
Yeah, that didn't go quite according to plan. It was a little rushed in the end there. I didn't get the ratios of the epoxy mix right, so I had to take a more rapid approach to gluing this together. It is together, however, it was under an immense amount of haste. It's all sitting nice. The joins are acceptable. During this process, I'm pretty sure I lost several litres of bodily fluid, in the form of sweat, of course. But it's all together now. And I'm relieved. I'm going to leave that for 24 hours and I'm going to remove this substructure and I'm going to pull it out and continue with the rest of the build. Till then.
Like I said, a class act all the way. Anyway, the nightmare was fleeting. I may sound upbeat now, however, in the moment, darkness surrounded me and stretched into eternity. Reflecting on it now, I'm finding it difficult to relate to what I was saying earlier, which I'm sure is a feature of self-preservation. Otherwise, we humans wouldn't continue to do the things we do. Anyway, whatever I did worked, and the substrate was successfully made whole. Now that I've filed it away, this ends part 4, where part 3 began. Thanks for watching.